Well, I will be your moderator this afternoon. My name is Lauren Williams. I am the tech reporter for Think Progress, where I focus on how technology influences our culture. I also focus on civil liberties issues, including privacy and cybersecurity. So today we're going to talk about all of the new toys that law enforcement agencies get and how that could negatively impact everyday civilians. With me to talk about this is Nick Selby, who is a Texas law enforcement officer and also a security consultant. We have the Brennan Center for Justice's senior counsel, Rachel Levinson-Waldman. And also we have Juval Scott, who is a federal defender in the DMV. So to get started, I want to throw out a question to all of my panelists and ask them what they think about mass data collection, just routine data that local law enforcement agencies and federal law enforcement agencies collect, and how that is different from mass surveillance. Rachel?
Sure. Thanks so much. Thanks for moderating this, and thanks to all of you for being here. So I will say, and I think that at least one of my panelists will not agree with me on this, that I actually don't see a big difference between mass collection and mass surveillance. I think those two are quite linked, because I think it's in part mass collection that enables mass surveillance. And if you are collecting, then part of the reason you're doing it is to surveil either at the time or after the fact. Obviously, there's an argument that can be made that you're collecting everything, but you're just picking out the stuff you need. You're not really sort of doing mass targeting. But I think what mass surveillance is kind of keeping an eye on everyone in order to be able to decide whom you want to target. And that is one of the things that mass collection enables as well. So I see the two of them as very linked.
Would you agree, Nick? Have you seen that in your law enforcement role?
I see a distinction, and I struggle with this as well. In addition to being a police detective down in Texas, I'm also the CEO of a company called StreetCred Software, and we sell intelligence systems to law enforcement agencies. So I think about this kind of a lot. I think that there's a third camp that isn't being talked about. I do think that there's definitely a link between mass collection and mass surveillance. But as a detective, and I work, the cases that I work are typically child exploitation and child pornography, where, I don't think that there's anybody in this room who doesn't want me to get that person in jail right now, when I have warrants and when I have probable cause. If I can rely on data that has been collected for a specific surveillance, have you seen my suspect anywhere in the last 48 hours? I don't consider that to be an abuse of the mass collection of data. I'm using it, I think, for what it's intended for. When I start getting into situations where I'm saying, hey, show me all of the people who drive red Toyotas and go more than 10 miles an hour over the speed limit on Thursday nights, now I'm conducting mass surveillance. And now I'm getting a whole group of people that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten had the data not been there in the first place. So I do think that there's a big difference between mass surveillance and mass collection, because mass collection can be used in the way that I think most people, I am a civil libertarian, I don't mind what I just said. If I gather all the license plate, we were talking a little bit earlier, I was looking for somebody who was having sex with infants, and we had no reason to believe that there was a child in immediate danger. I have no problem asking a database of license plates where that guy is right now. And that's how we got him. And a few hours later, he was in jail, and I'm very happy about that. That's not an abuse of mass collection.
Juval, have you seen any abuse, even when it's been specified to Nick's, as Nick just said?
I think that the problem, as I see it, is that it's not necessarily that contained. I appreciate that Nick and his colleagues are doing more contained requests and therefore are getting very limited information, but most of the requests aren't that contained. The other problem that I have with it in some sense is it's always great to go to the extreme, right? Like, I'm not unreasonable. I don't want people who like to have sex with little kids out on the street either. But I don't want my information intruded on so that we can capture the anomaly. And that, I think that's kind of, that's the problem for me, is that there's too much of a risk for abuse, and we see it in the way cases are processed all the time. And the problem is when you challenge it under a Fourth Amendment, what you end up having is the judge saying, hold on, but do we really care that this person's rights were violated? After all, he really is a bad guy.
And I don't disagree that there's a very high possibility of abuse when you have a gigantic database of all of the license plates in America and where everybody is. That is something that, if you take it directly to the edge case, which I think we should do, the potential for abuse is very high. I think that the way my agency works with very, very strict, we don't do any subpoenas, we don't do any administrative orders. Everything we do is with a search warrant. With every single case I have judicial oversight, and often I have to have what devolve into Talmudic debates with the judge to talk about like exactly how I got what I got, because usually I'm getting cyber clues, and that's kind of hard to explain. But I think that the volume of cases on the local and county level, where we are in fact looking for things like child pornographers, human traffickers, drug dealers, people wanted for assault or armed robbery, carjacking, these kinds of sort of run-of-the-mill crimes that don't sound very sexy, the sort of suck and blow of everyday policing. A lot of the technologies down at our level are really useful because it doesn't sound like much, but to us and to the community, it is a huge deal. Somebody sticks a gun in the face of somebody at the Dollar General, they want to know why we don't have them in jail. And I'll take anything I can get, pretty much, as long as I do it the right way, which is with a warrant.
So when do, did you want to?
If I could just, again, I'm not anti-police work. I think that the work that law enforcement does is incredibly valuable, and we were having this conversation earlier, and I think perhaps my perspective is a little bit tinted by the fact that I work in federal court. So where state agencies feel as though they're limited, as a defense attorney in federal court, there are no such limits.
Yeah.
And so, my viewpoint is it's not as limited as him saying, okay, I'm trying to isolate this person who assaulted the old lady downtown in the community. I'm representing someone who gets pulled over on an ordinary traffic violation, has cash, for instance, maybe has come over the border at some point, but not with cash. And then all of a sudden, I'm getting every time he crossed the border from the federal government within the last year, even though he lives on the border and there's no law that says you can't go back and forth over the border. And that is what's being used to then prove that my client has done something wrong, when in fact they have no evidence to that effect. And none of their evidence points to the actual allegations in their complaint or their indictment. So I do think that there is a difference when you start to allow the federal government to come in and do these, because folks, they have no limits on what they can pull on you. It's scary.
It is scary, but I will say one thing without getting us into a rabbit hole. Borders are these magical places, and doing child porn, borders are the best thing in the world, because child pornographers take their porn with them in their laptop, and at a border, all bets are off. Your privacy, you don't have any, and you are basically, if you're saying I want to leave or come back in, you are opening yourself up to searches that are not covered by people who are already inside the country. The borders probably, I get what you're saying completely. I'm more concerned, in fact, with the kinds of asset forfeiture laws that allow me as a police officer, upon seeing that pile of cash, to say, oh, let me take that and your car, thank you. And I really don't have to prove much under the laws. Not in my agency, but under the laws, it's pretty vague. But borders, and that gets me a little bit back of, if we're not looking at the license plates, or if we're holding on to the license plates, first of all, I don't see being able to flush out my license plates. I know ACLU wants me to hold them for something like 30 days. I don't understand how you can have a retention period measured in days when you have statutes of limitation measured in years. I don't understand that.
And I guess that was one of the pieces that I wanted to pick up, especially connected to what Juval was saying about, there's a defendant, there's a suspect, and there's a year's worth of data to look at. And maybe that data is being pulled to make allegations about something that aren't even sort of the subject of the charge. But even if they are, I think it's problematic to have that range of data available for law enforcement or anybody else. I don't contest that it might be useful. And it might even be useful in the case of serious crimes. But I think that's not quite the question for a couple of reasons. One of them is one of the points that Juval was making, that these cases basically come down in the context of, I mean, they're criminal cases, right? So it's suppression hearings, it's various other kinds of motions. It's people who at least usually look guilty of what they're charged with. They may or may not be, and there may have been, various sort of decisions that went into deciding, whom to target, what kinds of cases are you focusing on, those sorts of things. But judges are certainly very much swayed by the fact that they can see, oh, this person seems to have committed this crime, or there's this criminal history, like, well, I don't want them on the street, so let me figure out some way that I can say this is okay for them, which then bleeds over into this is okay for all of the rest of us. But then I think more broadly, thinking about sort of how long we hold on to information. So, in the case of, say, license plate readers, I think a very reasonable argument, license plate readers make me a little queasy generally, but it's public information, right? If you are driving a car, your license plate is visible. You know that a police officer can look at it, can run your plate, can find out at least some information about who you are. So I think there's one thing to say, okay, there are going to be license plate readers either that are running all plates, or in the case, a sort of classic Amber Alert, right? So there's somebody driving, they have this license plate, we're going to activate all of the license plate readers out there to look for that car. I think that's probably like if they're going to be license plate readers, is like one end of the spectrum, the sort of single most defensible use. Then you get to, okay, are they running all plates that are out there to run them against a hot list? Then if they are, what's in that hot list? Is it, like, convicted murderers who have escaped prison? Is it, people who are like a little behind on their child support payments, and, where in between? And then we get to the question of how long is that information kept? And if there's all this information that's being captured, not on the basis of any individualized suspicion, but just that it's easy to get it, I don't think that there's any justification for retaining it for a long period of time, except that it makes it easier for law enforcement. And I understand it makes it easier for law enforcement. And I understand that there may be people whose information in there who absolutely should be found. But I think that's very different from saying, well, we're just going to hang on to it because at some point in the future it's going to be useful. And that's not traditionally sort of how we've conceived of our law enforcement function and what we see law enforcement being able to do.
These are really, really excellent points. I think that on the other side of it, it's not a simple question of useful and nice to have. It's specifically useful for a few different things over periods of time that are not always obvious at the time. Going back and taking a look at, and this gets into sort of what I would say is quasi-mass surveillance. If I've got a series of rapes that happen in a certain subdivision or a certain neighborhood, it's more than just nice to be able to put a geofence around it and say, show me all of the license plates that entered and left within 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after each one of these rapes, and I can start making dots on the map, and I can start looking to see if just at the pattern of things moving. I still don't know what I'm looking at until I actually hone it down to a specific suspect or set of suspects. Same with homicides. I mean, it's the ability to dive into a corpus of data to stop to solve crimes that are otherwise very, very difficult to solve and which have real damage to the community. I think it goes beyond just nice to have. And there has to be a balance, and I don't know what the balance is.
Right, and I guess part of the question is how long is that information being kept, right? Do you keep it for a year or two? Or are you sort of going back and trying to solve long ago crimes? If you have a rash of crimes, say, and I'm actually not sure I'd even be in favor of this, but say you have information that's being kept for a week, say, that enables some looking back. It doesn't necessarily enable looking back at 3 months, but then there's other kinds of investigative work that we get on. But Juval, I know you were going to say something.
I think it's always easy to kind of come back to I I want to solve this rape, and so
Yeah.
therefore this information is useful. And so, to that I just simply propose the same kind of thing that I tell everyone, which is it's always easy to look at whether or not constitutional rights should or should not be expanded when you're talking about someone who's raped the neighbor or has done multiple rapes or has murdered someone. The problem is when that law is interpreted for people who are accused of crimes or ultimately convicted of crimes, it extends to us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how much room do we want people to have in this respect? Because this isn't about whether it's about whether or not criminals are apprehended to a certain extent, but it's more about what they're doing to those of us that aren't criminals. And I don't think that anyone agrees that the bulk of people inside the community are criminals. And the other problem that I have with kind of this mass use of data that then can ultimately be used at some point in the future dependent is that it allows for the, targeted policing patterns and the kind of, what should be but is not yet illegal profiling patterns that we already have. So now they can say, we're going to isolate this to these areas. Like ShotSpotter is the prime example. Do you have ShotSpotter in your suburbs? Because I don't have it in mine. So it doesn't, and there's a reason why. It doesn't make sense for it to be in the suburb, right? Sorry, ShotSpotter is this technology that basically in high crime areas where there's a lot of gun violence, correct me if I'm wrong at some point, where there's a lot of gun violence, they put this device at the top of the poles in the neighborhoods. What happens is when a gunshot goes off, it registers with ShotSpotter, which is like this agency. I think they're based out of California, and so it goes to this machine, and that machine can isolate the area of the gunshot within like a couple of blocks.
Actually, it's even more accurate than that. So the way ShotSpotter is an acoustical measurement system, which is essentially highfalutin microphones. It needs to triangulate, so you have to have at least 3. It has a gross accuracy of 25 meters, but it also has a relative accuracy of millimeters. So it might tell you that the 6 gunshots happened within 25 meters. But if you go to that place and you find one of the shell casings, you will find all of the other shell casings within millimeters of one another. So it'll tell you where the group is. Basically, the time of arrival for the sound of a gunshot hits the sensor, and it hits all the sensors. And what they do is they use GPS synchronized time to figure out exactly where the shots came from through triangulation. That's how it works. And another reason why it isn't in the suburbs is it is so expensive that city councils want to slash their wrists and ankles in a warm bathtub. It used to be $1 million a square mile. Now it's about, I think it's $100,000 a square mile. And so what they end up doing is they say, well, we have a gunshot problem. People are screaming about the gunshots. And they end up putting in a couple of square miles. When that is, quote, successful, and we can debate, there's all sorts of problems with how it is successful. But one of the first things ShotSpotter does is it quintuples or more the number of gunshots that the police department knows about. Because what happens is in these kinds of areas, there are so many gunshots and there's such distrust of the police that most people just don't call 911 when a gunshot goes off. So suddenly your rate of gunfire goes from 300 a year to 900 a year on day 2 because you're catching all the gunshots. And that's one of the problems.
Well, but kind of in using that as an example, so I agree that it shouldn't be in the suburbs. The cost-benefit analysis wouldn't make sense. But so this is in primarily high poverty minority areas, right? But what ultimately happens, and I love that you narrowed it down to millimeters, is because in every case that I've had ShotSpotter technology on, they've not even been close to where the shots were. They've been so far away, and they've apprehended and harassed and illegally searched. I've had evidence suppressed based upon these searches. Dozens of people, even though they have the technology, know exactly where the shots were.
But your statement was that, and I really thought this was very important, the officers weren't using ShotSpotter the way it's supposed to be used.
Correct.
They were using it basically as a pretext to get into a certain neighborhood and saying, hey, there were gunshots near here, turn around.
Exactly.
Which is, really bad.
Exactly, and I think that that's where we kind of can get into, not just ShotSpotter, use that as an example because it's something that's so concentrated, but like expand it to some of these other things. Where's the limit? Are we stopping at rapists? Are we stopping at the people who harm children? Are we extending it to the purse snatcher? I mean, where does it go? And then how much of your freedom are you willing to give up so that they can get people who commit petty crimes even?
So it sounds like there needs to be a culture shift within law enforcement agencies. So what policies should be in place so that this data and this new technology that potentially could help save people's lives isn't weaponized and used as an agent of harassment against already marginalized communities?
I'm just trying to think of an analogy, and the analogy that I have is FLIR. Forward-looking infrared, basically heat sensors. These things cost about $5,000, and every agency that has a fire department has a FLIR unit, and we use it like after there's a fire, the firemen walk through the house and they use the FLIR to go up in all the corners and walls to make sure that the fire's actually out. They look for hot spots. As a police officer, I could take the FLIR unit and point it at the wall, and I can see people inside the house. I can see where people were, on a cold night. I can see where somebody was 15, 20 minutes ago. It doesn't get used because the thing costs like $5,000, and everybody gets upset. And I think we were talking outside a little bit. There's a self-limiting factor that a lot of the really cool, sexy technologies are just out of the reach of most local and even county law enforcement agencies. Their budgets come from property taxes. Nobody wants higher property taxes. So, I think the nationwide average is 80% of it goes to salaries, and the rest is left over for these kinds of toys. The restrictions on these things are massive, at least in the agencies that I've worked at.
But one of the things I suspect, and I think this sort of plays out across a variety of technologies, is that they're absolutely, very costly and often cost prohibitive at the beginning. Inevitably, those costs go down, right? Technology's developed, they become more available to the person on the street. The technology gets more sophisticated. It gets less expensive to develop various parts of it, and it goes from often, right, being used by sort of often it starts at kind of military/national security level, right? Then it goes to federal, then it goes to state and local, then it ends up sort of in the hands of people on the street, and then at that point people think, well, it's in the hands of people on the street, so sort of who cares? But that has sort of bypassed in some ways constitutional restrictions, and it makes it much easier. Then there are a couple of ways that it can get fairly easily to state and local law enforcement, right? So one is the federal government says, well, we're either going to just share this technology with you or we're going to give it grants. So that kind of takes the financial responsibility out of the hands of state and locals, or it just becomes cheap enough, right? Which is what even with thermal imaging, you can now actually buy very inexpensive thermal. I mean, I could, with not much effort, buy a thermal imaging
for $400
technology
and put it on your iPhone.
And if that, and I think that's going down like as we speak.
But it's different, and I will just say this. I mean, anybody who's seen a cop walking out laboring under the load that they have on their belt and all that crap, because once they hit it, they can never get rid of it. I don't know if people are aware, but the walkie-talkie that the cop has costs approximately $4,500. Still.
But why?
They cost that because you should be able to throw them at somebody running away and hit them and knock them down and still pick it up and say 10-15. I mean, these things are built for rugged use, and they have to be mission critical, so they have to be built to mil spec. And then as soon as the prices started to come down, Motorola changed the game and made an entirely new digital network, so everybody had to throw away all the radios that they had and rebuy all the radios. The kinds of economies of scale that we get with technological advancement in the world does not filter down to law enforcement, where there's $3,000 Panasonic Toughbooks that still look like a 1980s mainframe with white on black background, right? Text on black background, all in capital letters. Why? Telex. Everything is reverse compatible to Telex. So this is the kind of technology that they have, and it's all super expensive. But yeah, I mean,
right. So
some of them come down.
Right. And I think that is a fair point and a well taken point. I do suspect that sort of writ large, the arc of the cost of these technologies is coming down. But I take your point that they may not go down at the same rate that they go down for the consumer that has different needs.
So is this just an inevitability? Should we just, as citizens, should I just accept that, everything I do could potentially wind up in a giant server of my local law enforcement?
I hope not. I mean, it's why I urge people who practice criminal defense to continue to fight against these things. And, there are cases and there are instances where in the criminal context we're winning these cases. And warrants are being required in some jurisdictions. Just recently, like out in California, Fourth Circuit, California just actually had the law signed. Jerry Brown just signed in the law in California that warrants are required before they can do this to get the stingray things, and that's progress.
And that's great.
And I think that what we as citizens should insist upon is that to the extent that our information is inevitably collected, that there are limits and serious limits on it. And I think that for the most part, it ends up being challenged in the criminal context because, again, ordinary people, like how would you get into court typically to challenge this? And so if you're doing criminal defense work, you have to challenge it because even if you, for whatever reason, believe that your client doesn't deserve the break, you do.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say I don't think we should, and I would hope that we're not going to sort of say, oh, sure, we just know the stuff is being collected all the time. That is what it is. And I want to take a step back and sort of tease apart or articulate a couple of the strands of why I think it's problematic, which probably won't be a surprise to many of the people in this room. One is, especially when we're talking about collecting a lot of information and keeping it. If you're talking about even potentially even a couple of days worth of information, certainly when you're looking at a week, 2 weeks, a month, or a year, the ability to go back, and I would love to hear Nick's take on this because this is one of the things that we were talking about was, okay, what's the value to this information? But being able to go back and, reconstruct aspects of somebody's life, a Supreme Court case, sort of talking about like a day in the life versus a way of life, that you can extract so many pieces of information and so many inferences about where somebody goes, who they're going there with, what they're doing once they get there, and the ability for anyone. I mean, we often talk about this in the context of what the government is doing, certainly in terms of what commercial applications do, what industry can do. But even just thinking about the governmental side of it, the power of being able to get that information. Certainly thinking about the abuse. Certainly thinking if the government decides that they have a particular activist, a particular agitator in their sites, the power of being able to get that information. But then also, and again, if we're thinking about sort of a database of information, what it means even just to be able to pick out a particular moment in time. Maybe you don't have to say, oh, I can sit down, I can do big data crunching, I can elicit the inferences that you belong to a certain party based on what you're doing, but that you could literally find an embarrassing moment, a sensitive moment, a moment that could be used to target somebody, to harass somebody, to blackmail somebody, simply to reveal information that they consider private. But I don't think that we can stop just at saying, well, if you're not collecting it and keeping it for a long time, that's okay. Or if you're keeping it for a long time, but there's like a high level of process, there's a warrant before you get to it, that's fine too. In part because I think those databases are ripe for abuse. But I think even just for people knowing, okay, there's something watching all the time. There's a camera watching all the time. There's, cell phone information that's being collected all the time. My license plate is being captured all the time. If it's not being kept for a long period of time, I think there's a really significant chilling effect. And I think there's also just questions about, is that congruent with living in a democratic society?
I actually don't disagree with most of what you said. Walmart keeps its video for 90 days. I worked a lot of cases with Walmart, like organized retail crime. And, they get hit for like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they say 90 days later, tough noogies. That is an interesting data point for me, that Walmart, which does vigorously prosecute, considers 90 days to be basically, that's when the juice isn't worth the squeeze anymore in terms of data retention and video storage, because video storage is just hugely expensive. I think that when we look at a day in the life, so first of all, I think, and I think that my chief would, and everybody I work with would agree with me, that requiring a warrant for every single datum I access is totally not just reasonable, but I think that should be the minimum level of effort. I don't see why I should not have to go to a judge and explain exactly what got me to the point that I think that this data is the right place to look for this particular person doing this particular thing at this particular time. I think that where we get into issues are, I'm not sure how much work everybody out here has done, but when I'm looking for somebody, I'm going to start going to places like Google and Apple. And I don't care if you don't have a Gmail address. I could send Google an AOL address, and if you've got an Android phone, they're going to have stuff on you. And if I have a warrant, I can get this stuff out of private organizations. Even if you're using a burner phone, one of these spoof dial numbers, I can get that too. I can figure out where these things came from. A lot of the times when I'm writing search warrants, I'm not going into these massive, dark and secret police databases or federal databases. I'm calling Google. Everybody here is giving all their stuff up to Google and yelling that we shouldn't take it. I mean, on the one hand, I kind of think that it's funny. On the other hand, I really believe that these limits should be on the police because we are the most obvious and most immediate nexus between civilians and their government, even at the local level. So there has to be, the amount of extraordinary power that I have as an investigator means that I should be forced to make big rocks into little rocks if I don't do this right. And that's a perfectly reasonable compact to have with society.
I don't think anyone disagrees that in an ideal criminal justice system that every person who is charged would be convicted because everything has been done properly. And so then the role of the defense attorney is to make sure that all of those checks and balances have happened. The problem is that's just not the case.
Yeah.
I mean, and while I can appreciate that you and your colleagues are far more above board than a lot of the law enforcement officers that I've come into contact with, the reality is so many officers would resist. They do resist, not would, they do resist the need to get a warrant. They have no desire to try to preserve the constitutional rights of a citizen. They have no desire to do that. And I haven't seen where they're going for warrants for things. It's just not happening.
Well, I mean, you have a pretty, it's a small population, and again, there's that federal local thing. But yeah. I'll just say
Fair
this:
enough.
I work with agencies across the country because I do a lot of stuff with cyber and counterterror. And notice I haven't used the word terror until now. It's just that these guys happen to work in counterterror, and this concept of constitutional guardian is something that everybody I work with holds very, very dearly. How many cops who's an ACLU member or an EFF member? I mean, we really do get all Captain America on this, and I have testified against officers who haven't.
Was there a question? Yes.
I think it's great that I can tell you that in Virginia legislatively we've been trying very hard to move beyond the idea that police can collect a lot of information just because and keep it around for a long time just in case, and then access it to do probable cause by algorithm, and then engage in a process of prosecution which involves trial by surprise because we don't have open criminal discovery or any
I'm sorry,
meaningful.
You're using a couple of terms of art. I'm sorry, probable cause by algorithm?
Yeah,
I'm not being stupid. I don't know.
Probable cause by algorithm is when you take a whole bunch of data points and stick it together and say, this is my probable cause to go and get a warrant. This is my probable cause to be able to move forward with this prosecution.
And meaning that it's not necessarily individualized.
You didn't start with an individualized suspicion. You got a bunch of data points from the Law Enforcement Information Network, operated by NCIS or someplace, about this person's travel and transit across jurisdictional lines, or you just put together a picture of the person. But then you end up with that, and then you end up in a situation where when the trial goes forward, we don't have meaningful criminal discovery. So if you're a defense attorney, you show up for trial, you've never even seen the arrest record, much less anything else. And so the whole idea, although a number of my good friends in law enforcement in Virginia do take seriously constitutional guardianship, they fight fiercely against any kind of warrant requirement for data, for historical cell phone records. They fought us against for a warrant requirement for real-time cell phone history, and so I think you're very unusual in my experience in terms of a lot of the law enforcement people I work with.
Well, I don't know a single cellular or mobile network provider who will give me location data without a warrant.
Subpoena. You can get it in Virginia with a subpoena or court order anytime you
want.
want.
That's a Texas thing. I need a warrant. I think that you're highlighting a bunch of problems that are sort of out of the scope of, it comes into implementation. And I don't think, I mean, if you're not seeing arrest records as a defense attorney, there are huge systemic issues around that do not go into looking at license plates.
So these are the same folks who had an 8 million record license plate database at the state police that included every license plate of a car that crossed the Potomac River Bridge on the day of the first Obama inaugural, and every license plate that went to a Sarah Palin rally. And they didn't just keep it for that day or 2 days or 3 days to make sure that if something happened at those events that they had that information. They wanted to keep it forever. Prince William County has ALPRs out on I-95 taking a picture of every car that goes down the road, just in case. And they want to keep it for at least 365 days.
Right, and that's the data retention. I don't have a problem with them taking pictures of my license plate any more than I have a problem with you memorizing billboards as you drive down the highway. I mean, this is in public. It's retention and access that I think is the issue.
Yeah.
Well, and then I
That's
think
like saying my license plate isn't like my social security number. My social security
I didn't say that.
is identifiable unless you run it against the social security database. My license plate is personally identifiable the minute you run it against DMV. So you are keeping personally identifiable information about me just in case for an extended period of time.
We may be getting into semantics, but I do agree that most of the time one license plate equals one person.
Rachel, did you have?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, and I think also part of what you're articulating is decisions of resource allocation, right? So that if there's a criminal justice system that is not being well run, or in which somehow the resources are not being allocated to turn over arrest records, but those resources are being directed towards setting up the license plate readers, operating them full-time, paying the storage to keep the information, right? That's a decision, and that's not even necessary. I mean, to some extent, that's a law enforcement decision. To some extent, basically, that's just a surveillance decision. But to put the resources there instead of into other aspects of a criminal justice system.
I'd also, just before this gentleman asks a question, I'd also toss out that part of the problem is that while they can gather all of this data so that way they can then later come back and cumulatively use it so that your client can be prosecuted, you can't request that information so that you can show that he was elsewhere. So, I mean, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we're going to use it so that people can be locked in cages, then we ought to be able to use it so that clients can also be exonerated.
I'm pretty sure you can buy it from Vigilant. I am. I mean, honestly, I think you can just set up an account with Vigilant and you can print out where they saw them. And Vigilant, talk about probable cause by algorithm, Vigilant will tell you the best time and location to find somebody based on pattern of life analysis that they do as a private company. And they will tell you.
I think the government needs a warrant to buy it from Vigilant.
We don't have it in my agency. Every time, I didn't need a warrant when I had, but that was exigency with the child porn case. He was leaving.
Sorry, you have a question?
Yeah, comment, I guess.
Okay.
I'm a Canuck. I'm a visitor from another planet known as Canada. And, you know, I've had a great stay in Washington. One of the anxious moments I have is, as a traveler, I experience the border. And what I think is important about this conversation is the extent to which our new technologies and our new age of anxiety, not so new age of anxiety, is turning the internal landscape as increasingly like the border, where, you know, I'm taking my shoes off, I'm walking through the machine, there's cameras, there's all of that. And I think, you know, one thing this conference has reminded me is how much some communities feel like they live at the border all the time. So I get it. We want to have a roundtable solution makers, and I'm really glad law enforcement's here today, as they were yesterday, talking about these issues, because we need to talk more and to live each other's experiences. It's got to be that roundtable approach, I think. That kind of dialogue is happening in Toronto with the Toronto Police and the community on street checks, a sort of version of stop and frisk that's facing huge scrutiny in Canada. I also want to commend a paper to you, which I had a hand in writing for the Ontario Information and Privacy Commissioner's Office, which is called Surveillance Then and Now, Securing Privacy in Public Spaces. I really think we have to remember that our right to privacy doesn't die in public spaces. There's all sorts of constitutional questions there and debate about that, but it's a normative discussion. It's about what kind of society we want to live in. And it's what kind of society we want to live in as cops, as citizens who are cops, so on. So just leave it at that.
So I think that's a great comment, and I want to pick up on two strands of that. One is that I completely agree about the constitutional protections in private. I've also, in public, I've also been working on a piece very much related to Fourth Amendment protections in public, and sort of thinking through what does it mean to say that we have privacy in public, and how does the case law so far, which I think has often been interpreted to say, oh, anything that you do in public, anywhere you are, the public information that shows, you have no sort of privacy interest in that. I think the Supreme Court has actually started pushing back on that. The lower courts have as well. And I think there's a very robust argument to be made, and an administrable argument to be made that when there's sort of certain factors that come together, you can really make a strong argument for saying there are Fourth Amendment protections, you need a warrant. Keep an eye out for my article, and I will definitely check out yours, which sounds very relevant.
I'd like to get it. I can't really write down right now.
And then the other piece is a comment that really ties into discussions that I've just found fascinating and very compelling at the conference, of thinking about the intersection of surveillance, marginalized communities, discrimination, and the ways in which there's sort of a notion of, well, there are protections, there are constitutional protections, but then there are exceptions, and increasingly those exceptions are, so there's an exception at the border. There are effectively exceptions in huge numbers of poor African American, Latino communities. There are, and the fact that the exception that there's an exception at the border, it's sort of often not an accident who ends up being targeted at the border. And so thinking about, well, sort of whether it's what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Is it privacy for thee but not for me, or the other way around? And I think that's a really important point. And I think that's a conversation that we're having more, and that we need to keep having.
Hi. I just wanted to remark on the comment that, Nick, you made about you don't have a problem if someone wants to memorize billboards as they drive down the highway. And I'm sort of surprised to hear that you think that it's the same thing. Because what I heard you say earlier was this technology is an incredible boon, right? It's something that we cannot do without it, right? We need this technology for the rape and murder cases that you're bringing up. But somehow... But, I mean, there is no cop who does actually memorize all of the license plates of all of the cars that drive down the highway, right? Even though you could have one cop who sits and memorizes license plates for a couple of minutes if they were particularly...
I was going to say, for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, if they were particularly weird, right?
Yeah.
But the scale and the lack of personal interaction makes this a completely different thing. And I don't think that it's fair to compare... if you want to, of course, your license plate's out in public, therefore we should be able to aggregate all of it into this database. Mm-hmm. This huge data set is a massively different thing because of the size, because of the scale, and because of the fact that I can't walk down the street and go, oh yeah, that's that weird cop who can memorize license plates, and have a chat with him, right? There's a difference in the way, in the recourse that we have as a public.
Yeah. When
you're facing a system that is that large, that powerful, has that kind of capacity that's well beyond human capacity, and that you can't relate to.
It's a really good point. Let me clarify and then add to it a little bit. What I think I was talking about before was we wouldn't be able to solve it if we threw away all the license plates after 6 days or 6 hours or something like that. That the holding on to them allows us to go back and investigate stuff that we didn't know happened now, but maybe 3 weeks from now or 5 weeks from now we discover. This happens all the time. There are 255 law enforcement agencies between Dallas and Fort Worth. And the chance that somebody is committing serial crimes in multiple jurisdictions is really, really high. Sometimes it takes a while to figure this out because we don't talk. Cops are absolutely terrible at sharing information. They're horrible at it. So once we figure it out, and that could be a long time, the ability to go back and start to aggregate is something that's important. The opposite side of what you just pointed out, I kind of look at it in the same way I look at open source intelligence on the internet. If you're going to say something on Twitter, of course I have the right to look at what you're saying on Twitter, because you're saying it on Twitter. And just because Twitter's fire hose is a gigabit feed doesn't mean that I can't use technology to do it. But I will tell you that here's the downside. You were just saying a little bit earlier, what do? Do you only do it after kidnappers, or maybe you do it for stolen cars, or maybe you do it for murderers who've just escaped? The biggest problem with license plate readers in cars is that it becomes this bitching Betty, just like ShotSpotter used to. The constancy of false alarms and false positives, or even real alarms. I don't know if anybody's ever ridden in a police car with an LPR with a hot sheet. You're driving down the street, it's like ding, 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 ding. I mean, there's so many things out there. Every cop turns it off. They simply can't keep up with it. And that's one of those self-limiting things which makes it so that people go back and look for very specific things within that database. Probably because nobody really knows how to do it right and go back and start mining. It takes a lot of intellectual horsepower to start mining that data correctly. But I do take your point. I mean, it is the aggregation of information that hasn't always been considered to be public. But I do think that the license plate is public. That's its purpose.
Just to kind of
Thought it was.
to follow that a little bit, one of the things that you said is the reason why it's enormously important is because cops are bad at sharing information. I don't know that we ought to determine which technologies should or should not be used based upon like bad communication between agencies. That's something that can be resolved just kind of on a different level and has nothing to do with privacy. But in looking at the license plate issue, again, when I agree that I think it's very different. You can ride down the street and look at billboards and you can see license plates and sure, it's not private, right? But when other agencies and when other places, for instance, like when Iowa Civil Liberties Union asked these professors at St. Ambrose University to take a look at stop patterns in Iowa City, they put 4 people on corners and have them individually write down the license plate numbers. Like if you want to do that, that's fine, but that's not what's happening. It's like this big mass like gathering of information, and it's like, oh, okay, well, we've got Juval Scott here. I wonder if maybe she, and then it goes back, and it's not the same.
Well, I want to say this. I was not justifying the use of the technology by the fact that cops don't talk. I was saying the reason that it sometimes takes an incomprehensibly long time to figure out that there's actually a crime pattern going on is because cops are bad at sharing technology, or at sharing information with one another. So I heard somebody say, no, it's not. I will say this. If somebody runs over your dog, the first question that the officer says is, did you get the license plate number? It is a public marking which is designed to track a vehicle in the event of an emergency or some kind of law enforcement incident. That's what it's for.
Right, in the event of an emergency or law enforcement incident.
Right.
Not in the event that I'm driving down the street having, a conversation with my husband.
What I'm
as we
saying
go
is
to
you
the
can
winery.
translate that in the event of an emergency or a law enforcement incident. I'm not saying that you can't. You can sit outside and watch license plates all day. You can do it with a video recorder. Walmart does it with a video recorder.
can.
So does Target. Every parking lot they have. What I'm saying is that it only gets translated, and I know that this sounds a little bit like the arguments of a couple of years ago. We only look at your phone numbers when we want to know something. But I mean, that is the way it's supposed to be working.
Oh, did you want to?
Well, yeah, and I guess I was just going to add in. So it's true. I could sit on my, front lawn. I could sit on a corner, watch cars go by. I could write down as many license plates as I could. I don't think I have access to the databases that would translate that into information. But a police officer could do the same, right? A police officer could absolutely stand on the corner, jot down every single plate they see, and at least under current law, could run all of those against a database to see what comes up. And there wouldn't...
Dodgy. To run every plate?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same as running against a database. Yeah, I mean, this may be going slightly afield. I'd say certainly current case law suggests that if an officer pulls up behind you and has nothing better to do, they can
play 28 bingo.
Yes.
They can run your plate.
Yeah.
They can't pull you over just because they have nothing better to do, but they can see what comes up, right?
Right.
But that is a different resource allocation, right? That is an actual officer who's getting a salary, who is spending their time doing nothing besides looking at license plates, which A, maybe isn't a great use of time, but B, if somebody in their wisdom decides it is, then okay, but part of what has protected our privacy in the past is the fact that those resource decisions have to be made and that it is expensive to do that. And that one of the consequences, and I take your point from earlier that, we can say this technology is super cheap. Well, okay, it's not super cheap all the time, right? It could be expensive to buy it, it could be expensive to maintain it. But that often it's much cheaper than having an officer do the same thing. And for some of these, it would literally be impossible
Sure.
for an individual to do the same thing the technology is doing. And that's one of the things that has effectively sort of constrained the way information collection and surveillance happens, because it's just expensive for a person to do. And so one of the things that, that I end up talking about in this paper is you could look at, how much cheaper is something, how much longer is sort of what's the period of information that's collecting? Could it extract information about somebody who's at home? And we've kind of, by happenstance of the way the discussion's been going, we've been focusing a lot on license plate readers, and I think there are a lot of fascinating issues surrounding that. But we also haven't talked about things like cell phone tracking, right? Which then becomes much more personal. You do not presume that you are sort of revealing that same kind of location information. Unlike with a license plate reader, where this could happen, but not as often in the same way. You could get lots of information about somebody inside a home for which you would otherwise need a warrant, right? There's even like a whole extra universe of issues that come up with some of the other kinds of tracking technologies.
We have a
Hello? In a sense, license plate cameras sort of swallow the whole. But the thought that I had sort of when I read the description for today was one of my favorite subjects to be mad at is automatic tolling, electronic tolling. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area where they got rid of the toll takers on the Golden Gate Bridge. And I was, what are you doing? People have had fast track forever and like to do it. And I used to argue with my sister about, well, I don't want to be tracked and blah, blah, blah. I'll take the cash and have to do it. And now, so they put in a system where I do have an anonymous fast track that I load up with cash, that I have to go to one specific office in downtown San Francisco to do. There might be other places to do it, but there may be fees attached to doing it. So the price for maintaining my privacy, which it turns out isn't private anyway, because they still take a picture of your license plate when you're at the toll, in the event of the crime of not paying your toll as you go through this. But one of the things as part of this discussion, it's all very interesting and there's so much to say in the direction that it was going, is the vocabulary is something where, well, it's about ultimately the crimes we're going to investigate. And I think some of the rhetoric around the discussion is, well, there's bad people doing bad things, and you're telling us to turn off one of the tools that we use to catch the bad people doing bad things. And I think all the people who self-identify as being good people are reluctant to do that. But when they had the discussion for the toll taking, I think the good people are not identifying that this affects them in a way that's deleterious to their own sense of liberty and freedom. And I guess the question, back as a discussion topic, is how do we change that debate so that the self-identifying good people recognize that when we drop these protections and allow these databases tracking our lives, just going about our business, how do you know that you're not going to end up characterized as a bad person that is also going to be caught in this net?
I think it's even worse, and I was going to say this earlier, and then I just talked myself out of it. It's with a toll tag, I think there's really, really bright lines that are different from the license plates. I don't know why people aren't more freaked out about toll tags, because one of the things that NYPD got caught doing at some point was putting Easy Pass readers in the city of New York. And now, that is not a public thing. That is, the compact that we have is, we give you this money, we get a little bit less on the toll, and you use it at these toll locations. This is not to determine whether I went through Midtown. This is not to determine whether I went on small streets.
And those are still very much up. I
Yeah.
mean, sort of,
And that's a
saying get
clear
caught
violation.
suggests that they were like, ooh, sorry, we're going to take them down.
Well,
They're up, they're getting that
okay,
information.
and I
Yeah.
didn't
And
follow
and
it.
this is not to ding but just to sort of give
Yeah,
context
and
to that.
That's to
They're
me
up.
a real violation. The other thing, though, is that the encryption on these things has been played with a number of different times. A number of people have come out with ways of actually lighting those little suckers up and getting them to tell them your account information. And I mean, it's sort of very similar to the whole RFID. Do you want that in your passport? Do you want that in your Oyster card? Do you want that? This gets into that kind of thing. And I think that in these cases, it's much easier for me to understand limitations on that, because when you buy it and give your money, you are entering a transaction with the understanding that it's going to be used for specific things, which I think is different from license plates.
It is, except for then, say for instance, on your drug case, And I am a person who just recently received one of those pictures of myself going through the thing and needing to pay that. But on your drug,
Make them prove it was you. They won't be able to.
well, interestingly enough, it didn't read my Easy Pass, but that's neither here nor there. What has happened in a case that I've had is that the client was alleged to have gone to Chicago. It was a case out of Milwaukee. Client was alleged as part of a drug conspiracy to have gone to and from Chicago for drug transactions, drug delivery, money delivery. And what they did was they pooled that information. The government subpoenaed that information.
This was a federal case?
It was a federal case.
I couldn't. We've tried. When we really want somebody, we can't get it.
Right, and that client ended up not being convicted for other things, one of which is she wasn't guilty. But little small fact there. But they were pulling that information. They said, "Oh, well, see, she's gone to Chicago. Here's the Easy Pass information." She wasn't guilty of what she did. She was a retired school teacher. She was a retired school teacher who was 70 years old, and never, ever in life had she had as much as a traffic ticket. She had a library fine one time in 1979.
So she was just lying in wait, you're saying?
No, she was related.
The
She was
ultimate long con.
right. Well, she was related to people who were involved, that were involved in crime, but she herself was not. And they tied her in as a means of attempting to bully her other relatives into pleading guilty and things of that nature. And that is, that these things. You're right to be scared about the Easy Pass.
Absolutely.
My husband has Easy Passes on our cars. I was the person who was driving through the poll, and I always let him send me the tickets afterward. But
Can you detach yours from the car and put it in a plywood?
yes.
Okay, ours too, but there's some that are sticking to the windshield. They're not transferable to the
Texas is like
person,
that.
And you can't hide it.
Oh.
Question in the back?
Let me try and cut through some confusion on the license plate issue. I'm going to talk about chilling effects. Dramatic 6 orders of magnitude scale increases in ability means it's a different ability. Take a library. Old style libraries put your name on a card and stuck it in the back of a book when you checked it out, and then that card stayed in the book when you returned it. In theory, it was possible for someone to go through 5 million volumes in a library and figure out everything you had checked out. No one could. If libraries currently centralize that information and made it available, and librarians try very hard not to make it available, including usually secure destruction of backups after a book is returned, you still can't get it. But if they made it centrally available the way we're talking about license plates, readers would be chilled. You would be afraid to take books out. By saying that we should ubiquitously collect license plate information and then store it for unlimited periods of time, just in case it is useful, it chills freedom of association and freedom of transportation. That's the issue that is bothering people, even if they can't necessarily articulate it. We're enabling ubiquitous permanent tracking of where people are going, assuming that their cars correspond to people, which in most places is true. And so saying, yeah, it might be useful for secondary uses, like the occasional time when we need to pull week-old or even month-old information, is missing the point about the chilling effect of being able to track 10 to the 8th license plates per day instead of 10. It's the difference between a single individual and large-scale machine-enabled surveillance. And that is the difference in this discussion and why it matters.
Really well put.
Thank you. I like that.
By the way, I agree with everything you said. I'm not advocating for unlimited storage. I just don't know how to square the specific circle of retention periods that are less than the periods that we have to investigate crimes. I don't know how to do that. If there is evidence of a crime that we can get to, and the statute of limitations is 3 years, but I threw away all the information on day 90, I don't have a solution for this, but I know that the solution has to take into account some of the legitimate uses that law enforcement has for public safety and public health.
But under that scenario, then we would maintain it for life, because the statute of limitations on murder is life, and you don't know whether or not the information you're gathering is connected to a murder.
Let me go back to that last statement. I don't know how to solve this.
In Virginia, there's no statute of limitations on any felony.
God.
Really? That's cool. I mean,
You need to move.
terrible.
You need to move.
I have a question for Juval. in the panel yesterday, the lunchtime plenary, there was an issue brought up about in a criminal case, in a federal criminal case, they were able to kind of flip the case around to ask about how it was that they collected certain information on a given suspect. And you brought up the case of ShotSpotter. This is the first time I've ever heard of it. But I work in audio, and just hearing that these are, fancy mics set up in a triangulation form makes me ask if they're using that as an audio version of video camera systems. Okay, great. And I'm wondering if you've been able to, in some of these cases where they pull out, ShotSpotter or whatever kind of new technology to kind of just turn the tables on the questioning to find out more about the technology itself and the way that information is being gathered on just the general population and not just on your client.
There's two things that I can kind of respond to in that. With regard to the information itself, as part of a Freedom of Information Act request that they did actually elect to respond to, we were able to find out in Milwaukee that they had this central repository of information they were collecting from ShotSpotter so that they could track gang activity. It actually didn't apply to any of my cases, but they are taking and filtering through some of that information on the ShotSpotter. It will depend on the area. What I didn't do with the ShotSpotter by way of information and gathering evidence was I was not able to cross-examine any officer or anything of that nature on the specifics because they didn't know how it worked. I knew more about how it worked than they did. What I did for purposes of suppression hearings is I would say the shots were over here. My client was way over here. You had no reason to seize him. The evidence should be suppressed, and I won. So I wasn't able to flip it in the way that you are suggesting because what they never did in any of my cases was call a representative of ShotSpotter to come and explain the technology. That perhaps was a deficiency on their part in some of the cases. I used it so that I could then show that my client wasn't in the area where the shots would have been and that the officers had acted improperly, that they had acted improperly in kind of the course of action that they took and not calling to the operator and asking where the location of those shots were, things of that nature.
I just want to say one more thing about your chilling effect, and I mean, I'm really happy that you articulated it like that because that's the kind of thing that has to be said. We have the same situation right now with body cameras on law enforcement officers, and actually I wrote about this, that the same argument. If an officer is accused of something 6 months later and you destroyed the video of it, right now, if a cop says he did something and there's no video, he is just disbelieved, and that's probably a good thing. But we have exactly the same surveillance issues of the officer's cameras with members of the public that he comes into contact with. The city of Seattle had a huge problem with this. I don't think it's just about license plate readers. The retention of this kind of surveillance data and the balance is really one of the toughest things that we have. And I think that conversations like this and statements like what you just made are really, really important. But I don't have anything like a solution.
We're actually about 20 minutes over, so I'm going to get one more new person asking a question, and then we should wrap up before the staff kick us out.
Sorry.
So I just wanted to ask about the concept of crowdsourcing mass surveillance, and to sort of give an example of that, which I'm currently a willing participant in. When an Amber Alert goes out, I get a ping on my phone. It says, here's make and model of a car, license plates, we have it. So, if I see that car, I can then call 911 and say, hey, I saw the car you're looking for with the Amber Alert. It would not surprise me at all if in a few years, instead of a ping to my phone saying, here's the info about a specific thing we're looking for, it says, ping, hey, we're in the middle of some investigations, and it'd be really helpful if you just took a panorama of everything around you so we can scan it for license plates, face prints, whatever. And it would also not surprise me if 3 or 4 years after that, when we all have Google Glass 2.0 cameras attached to our face, there's just an opt-in that says, if law enforcement really needs it, we're occasionally going to just for 30 seconds grab the video feed of your camera to use it for various things. So I'm curious, do you see sort of unique problems or issues raised by this concept of not just having mass surveillance with the new sort of tech that's available, but what happens when we have consumer-grade tech that's in everyone's hands that could be co-opted in certain ways?
And they're doing this in a lot of places. NYPD does this. There's several cities that are following this model, and usually it's storekeepers who are sick of getting robbed who are saying, yes, please use my camera. But we talked about some of those issues earlier. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it probably doesn't come as a surprise that I find that scenario terrifying because of the sort of power and visibility that it puts in law enforcement's hands and kind of the magnifying power, right? So you have the power of literally every single person on the street with a cell phone, with the Google Glass, whatever it is. And presumably, you know, even if we take a scenario that maybe some people would think is acceptable, I don't think law enforcement is going to be saying to every individual citizen, and they couldn't. We have a warrant. What would particularized suspicion mean when you're asking everybody to take a panoramic view, right? So there's probably not going to be a warrant. If there is, they're not going to be providing that. So it's literally just, hey, we think this might be useful. Maybe we could find something. And that I find terrifying. If I have a quick moment at the end, I'll respond to something Nick had said before, but I know we're out of time. Do you want to say something, Juval?
And of course, I would say, should that be the case, that you challenge it, because I challenge everything.
Okay. Did you have a?
Yeah. Can I say at least as my quick final word, which is that the body cam discussion, I think, is a discussion for a whole other time, and there have been other discussions about it. There's certainly a lot to talk about. I guess I just wanted to respond quickly to the point that Nick had made, and part of what we've been talking about, which is sort of how to square the circle of how long information is kept versus statute of limitations, right? Sort of why shouldn't you have the information available for as long as you would have to investigate and prosecute a crime? And I think I have at least two quick responses to that. One is something that has also come up in the national security context, right, with the Section 215 program, getting all of these phone numbers, that the usefulness degrades at some point. And it seems to degrade way before you get to the statute of limitations. So even if all you're talking about is the efficacy point, it's not necessarily useful forever and ever, or at least the cost of keeping it comes to outweigh the usefulness at sort of an identifiable point. But the other reason is that we don't make our decisions about this based only on law enforcement efficacy, right? So, and I guess this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is that it may well be useful, and it may be useful for a very serious crime to have it forever, but that's not the only metric that we look at as a society, right? We don't privilege those law enforcement decisions and the law enforcement benefits kind of above everything else, right? We balance them with a whole lot of other values, including kind of fundamental civil liberties and constitutional values, and I think those have to play in.
Absolutely right. And I think that it's my job to tell you why I think it's useful, and all I'm trying to do really is let people know it's not an evil thing where we're twirling our mustaches and saying, "Oh wow, we get to get all this." It's really most of the applications of this data are hardworking people trying to find bad people and put them away. When we decide as a society, many times rightfully, that's just too much for law enforcement to have. That's great. I just want people to understand what it is that we're giving up. One of the things that I got upset about, I think that when Edward Snowden put everything out there, the only thing that I looked at was selfishly. I said, wow, now all these people who are stealing children and selling them across borders and selling them in the United States into sexual slavery, now they understand tactics, techniques, and procedures that we use to go after them. And that wasn't good for me. That wasn't good for anybody. But you know what? Overall, I think as a society, we've decided that it was pretty darn good to know that these programs were happening. The costs are not always visible, and they're not always obvious. And I think that somebody said, we have to have these conversations. We have to have these conversations so that we understand what stake we all have in the game so that we can make a rational, informed decision and not just a knee-jerk reaction and say, well, let's just turn that off. That sounds terrible. We've got to understand at least how this thing could be used correctly before we say it can't be used correctly.
If I could just say one last thing. When you were referencing body cameras, you mentioned the difficulty of drawing the parallel of police wearing body cameras to collecting data on ordinary citizens. I think it's important that we recognize and understand that law enforcement works for the citizen. And so to the extent that we expend resources to track law enforcement data to make sure that they are doing the job that we as citizens pay them to do, it is distinctly different than gathering a bunch of information on ordinary citizens that are going about their business, not doing anything. And I think we have to draw that
I totally agree with you. I'm saying when I, as a law enforcement officer, bring my camera into this room, I'm now video recording all of you. I'm now engaging in mass video surveillance. There's got to be some understanding of that. That's all.
Yeah.
Yes.
Agreed. Sorry.
Well, we could talk about this all day.
Apparently.
But this has been a very lively and riveting discussion. I encourage you to connect with the panelists. But thank you so much for joining us today.